Good afternoon. I am going to talk to you today about some of my tips and tricks when doing wool applique. In the past, I have done these types of videos for needle turn fabric applique, and so I thought it would be kind of fun to do a mini video tutorial on wool applique. And there are some similarities between the wool applique and the fabric applique, as you'll be able to tell when I'm going through things, but there also obviously are some differences. So as with normal applique, with wool applique, you're going to start out with a pattern that has your templates in it. And I like to keep my patterns intact. So what I will do is I will either trace the patterns from the pattern, or I will copy these directly onto a piece of cardstock or regular paper. And that is a good reason to do that, is because if you're going to reuse these templates and reuse the pattern over and over again, having them reinforced by cardstock will help them keep their shape while you're tracing around them, instead of using it several times if it's just paper and having it get misshapen the more and more you work with it. So you can do that. And then once you have all your templates, I suggest you put them in a plastic bag, label it with the pattern, and then that way you can attach this plastic bag to the back of your pattern, either by paper clip or just staple it on. And when you file your pattern away, you'll always have the prepared templates ready to go. So we have our templates, and then you're going to need the tools to work with your templates. You're going to need a pencil, and you're going to need fusible web. For at least this is for my method, and I use Heat and Bond Feather Light, one of my favorite fusibles. Sorry about that with the camera. So you'll use the pencil to trace your templates. You're going to need a paper scissors to cut out the shapes that you've traced onto the fusible, and then you need a scissors to clip out the shapes from the wool. You will also need glue, in case after you fuse your design down, in case something comes unglued or unfused, you can just put a few little dots of glue to keep secure it, and so it doesn't go anywhere. Plus, most of the time I do not use fusible for stems in a project, so I use this to secure stems when I'm doing a project. Optionally, I have a bottle of Fray Check around, because what I like to do is I like to reinforce the background that I'm working on, so we don't get frayed threads where it ends up fraying into the seam allowance, and then your project ends up being not the size that it's supposed to be. Another item that I really like to have is a good light. And this is a light that I purchased a long time ago. So it probably, I don't know if you could still find something like it, but I mean the exact one, but you could find something like it if you Google task lights with a magnifier. I love having this magnifier because I could put my project underneath and I can see it. It's also a very good light. If I'm not using the magnifier, it directs the light right onto my project so I can see what I'm doing. So that's another good supply to have. And then, of course, you are going to need your pearl cotton threads. And this is my little collection of mostly neutrals that I like to work with. And then I also have my favorite kind of a needle. This one is a chenille needle. Mine is a size 22. I've also used size 24s. I like the 22 because it has a larger eye and it's easier to thread the pearl cotton through. You don't necessarily have to use pearl cotton. You can use floss that you use for cross stitch. You would just have to use it like 3 strands probably. I use Valdani. I use size 8, and I'm not sure if you can read the size in there, but you can use whichever size you prefer. Some people like the 12, which is thicker, and the 5, which is thinner. Or I think it's the other way around. Sorry about that. The 12 is thinner and the 5 is thicker. So it's all up to your preference of what you like to use. And so now we're going to move on to preparing your background. And I've already started on this one, so I will just explain to you what I've done. When I have a piece that I'm going to use, this is a block that I'm going to be putting my design on, I like to define the edges by tracing a line 1/2 inch in on all 4 sides, because what that does, it gives you room for your 1/4 inches in for your seam allowance, and then some extra room just in case, because you don't want your design to go into the seam allowance, and then when you end up stitching this or binding it, stitching it into a quilt or binding it, then your design gets cut off. So this basically just defines the space for your design. So that's the first thing you do, is do that. And then I recommend fray check. And what I've done on this is I have just taken this fray check and I've just run it lightly along the edges, all 4 sides of this square. And then that way it won't fray while you're sewing, because when you are doing any kind of applique, fabric or wool, you're going to handle the fabric a lot. And by doing that, you can end up fraying it. And sometimes it could fray, depending on the type of fabric you use, it could fray so much that you might lose your seam allowance. So that's why I like to reinforce the edges. Then the next thing you want to do to prepare is you want to find the center of your project. I like to use folding. So I will fold my item, and you could even reinforce the folds by pressing it if you like. I just kind of finger press, and then when you open it up, you have a kind of a crisscross of folds. And then I put a little, I'm not sure if you can see it, and I'll hold it up. I just kind of put a little white dot with a chalk pencil in the middle. And so that's another supply that you would need when you are doing your projects, is you can use a chalk pencil that's used for marking. And we use this a lot more in fabric applique than we would in wool, but this comes in handy to mark the edges of your project, and to put marks where you need to know where the center is. You can also lightly use this pencil to actually mark grid marks along your square or rectangle or whatever you are working on, if that helps you to put your pieces in place. And so then next we're going to move on to tracing of your appliques. This is the last part to really prepare until you get to where you're going to actually fuse the wool and start stitching. So here's a piece of, I'm going to use this piece of paper, fusible, just to demonstrate how I trace. Now the first thing is you have to check in your project to see if the templates have actually been reversed for use already, if you have a template that is not symmetrical. In this one, you'll see that the only thing that's not symmetrical is this base, because the handle goes this way and the spout goes this way in the actual template. And I want it to face this way on my project. And so because I want it to face this way on my project, and because when we fuse the tracings onto wool, onto the back of the wool, you need to flip a symmetrical piece before you trace it. So we'll go ahead and trace this. And you can see I'm just sticking close to the edges. And you could also see that since it's reinforced with the paper or the cardstock, that it doesn't really crumple up or hurt the design at all. So there you go, you have the pot, and it is facing the right way. So now the next thing I'm going to show you is I want to show you an item that we are going to trace. It's symmetrical, so you don't have to worry about it being reversed. Now this is all, we need 9 of these leaves, and they're all going to be from the same color wool. Wool is very expensive, so we don't want to waste wool if we can. And so what we do is we try to trace these as close together as possible. So I'll show you some that I've already traced and cut out. And here are my leaves that I cut out for the project. As you can see, I traced them as close together as possible so I have as little waste of wool as possible. Now, when you're tracing other things onto your paper, what you want to make sure you do is you want to make sure you leave enough of a space, and you don't want to try to waste your fusible too, even though it's not too expensive, but you want to leave enough space between one design or one template and the other so that there's room to cut it out in between. Because what we do when we cut these out from your fusible wool, and I'll show you by what I've already cut out, is you cut out outside the lines. And you can see the flower that I had already cut out. You cut out outside the lines because once you fuse this onto your wool, you want these lines to be able to follow with your scissors to cut out the wool piece. Otherwise, you'd be trying, if you cut out right on the line, then fused it, you'd be trying to follow the shape of your template on the piece of wool, and you might end up with a misshapen piece. So that's why we do it this way. So once you have all of your templates cut out and traced and ready to go, and see, here's some flowers that they're both coming from the same color, so I kept them together to try to save the wool. Once you have these all ready to fuse onto your wool, then it is time to fuse onto your wool. And that will be in part 2 of this. And come back and we will cover that in part 2, along with laying out your design and stitching. I hope you enjoyed this.